being an island, I mean, being just the fact that you guys are so big geographically and that you're an
Yeah.
island, how much of that actually plays into sort of the national ethos? Because, like when we see what's going on with the European Union and borders and all that stuff, these are people that are landlocked next to each other.
Yeah.
Borders and immigration are important, all that kind of stuff. And you guys really have the advantage of water. I mean, it really is just that simple in a way. But how much does that actually like affect policies and the way people think about the rest of the world and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, look, we've got oceans, and yeah, geographically, we are blessed to be apart from a lot of that turmoil. But those oceans didn't stop 50,000 people coming here by boat when Labor was in government. We had a very strict border control system under the Conservative government of John Howard. And when Labor were elected, they completely dismantled that because that wasn't in their thinking. They thought it was more humane to be a little bit more tolerant, but that tolerance led to hundreds of people, over 1,200 people drowning on our borders, trying to come here from places like Indonesia by boat. They weren't Indonesians; they'd travel from typically the Middle East.
Right. So they're
So
migrants actually from other countries that use
that's
Indonesia.
right.
Yeah.
Typically economic migrants. I'm sure there were some genuine refugees amongst them, but the overwhelming majority you would describe as economic migrants. And even the Labor Party came to acknowledge that and they started toughening up. And right now well, they say they back all the border protection policies that the Conservative side have, and they're not going to dismantle everything because it led to enormous suffering, not just the 1,200 people who drowned trying to get here, women and children amongst them, but also all our detention centres filled. We had just 50,000, I think even more than that, in detention centres, effectively locked up. And since we've managed to regain control of our borders, those detention centres have emptied out. There's not people drowning on the border. And we still have our refugee program. We still have a humanitarian intake. In fact, we've increased it. But we select people who are waiting and observing the rules because there was a period where people would argue that there are no queues to come here. These programs don't exist. But as we know, they do exist. And there's
Mhm.
people floundering, waiting in camps who don't have the resources to hop on a plane to Indonesia and then pay a people smuggler to come by boat to Australia. And they're now priorities. So our refugee intake, I think, is something to really be really proud of because we are very generous with that. And this isn't just simply porous borders. This is a proper humanitarian program where these people are brought here, they're given housing, healthcare, education, and help to become integrated into society.
But Rita, I thought you were supposed to be a cold-hearted, heartless conservative who wants to close borders and all that. But it sounds like you're actually okay with immigration, as you were an immigrant yourself. But
Mm.
you just want reasonable standards to let people
Absolutely.
live.
I mean, with this country, particularly economically, needs our economic migrants. They bring a great deal of wealth, and we're an aging nation. We need people who are working age and come here and are productive and contribute. But our humanitarian intake, we've got to be honest. It costs us a lot of money, but it is something I think that, as a rich nation, we're obliged to do, and I'm proud of that. However, that doesn't mean that it's a free for all, and whoever can just break the rules can come here first. Also, we've got to be mindful of where those refugees are coming from because of late there has been issues with uh, some not integrating as they should and as immigrants decades before them have integrated. So there is a lot of debate in this country about where should these refugees come from? Where do we prioritize Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East, Yazidis, or do we not consider religion at all and just bring in whoever's deemed the neediest? There was a poll just this week that was published that has absolutely blown people away. It was a poll that was by one of the more left-leaning pollsters. So there can be no sort of accusations, and it was published in the Guardian. So there can be no accusations of
Right.
this was some sort of rogue poll to try to change public sentiment. But it showed 1 in 2 Australians supports an immediate ban on Muslim migration. Now, this has absolutely shocked so many people who just refuse to accept that this sort of sentiment is out there, and it's there because people don't talk about this issue. People pretend that terrorism isn't happening, that it doesn't have a religion, and most Australians are smarter than that. Now, I don't actually agree with the immediate ban on Muslim migration. I'm not for that at all, but I can understand, and the poll didn't surprise me because I don't exist in this little tiny echo chamber that so many of the media seem to exist in, where I just think we need to talk about these things openly, because when you don't, that's when you have sentiment like this rising, and I don't think it's particularly healthy.
So isn't that the ultimate irony of your position,
Mm.
for you particularly, because as an immigrant from the Middle East, it's extremely personal to you. But for me and the people that are in our space that we see on Twitter that are talking about this stuff, that aren't doing it from a bigoted place, that want to help people when we can and all that, but also want to have proper vetting, they've put us in a really bizarre situation. And for you, I mean, I've seen you go on TV, and I saw something where you were on TV debating this guy, an anchor, and he kept implying you were saying all Muslims repeatedly,
Oh,
even though you never said it. We'll link to it below so people can see it. You never said it. It was the age-old argument that we have all the time here. And it's like,
mm.
man, she's from the Middle East. She was born to Muslim parents. She immigrated properly. Now she's trying to stand up for the very values that this country is for, and they're
Mm.
doing this to you too.
This bizarro alliance between the regressive left and Islamists, it is prevalent everywhere, in the UK, the US, and even in Australia. And it is bloody sick. It doesn't make any sense. The only sense it makes is that they share a common enemy, conservatives. But yeah, I think you're talking about appearance on morning television,
Yeah,
where
yeah, yeah.
I had written a piece about, you know, this terror has a religion, and we've got to acknowledge it. Again, I was at pains, as we always are, to say I'm talking about Islamists, I'm talking about the extremists, I'm not talking about the entire Muslim. All those qualifications were made, but no, nevertheless, even just talking about it, even identifying what is happening that is clear to anybody who hasn't got their head buried in the sand was abhorrent to this dude. And it brought up Christian terrorism, bombings at abortion clinics, which I think, the last one was he could find was about 15, 20 years ago. But nevertheless, you can't talk about Muslim based or Islamist based terror without mentioning the Christian. It's just
It
such
was pretty
nonsense.
great because you asked him when the last one was, and he had no
I had to
idea.
Google it.
Then he busted out his phone, and a few minutes later came back, and yeah, it turned out to be 15 or 20 years ago. I'm curious,
Uh,
because you guys haven't been hit with terrorism really until about 2 years ago in Sydney, and there was that hostage situation and all that. How
mm.
much did that actually change the discussion for you guys? Because you were seeing it everywhere else, again, surrounded by water, seemingly safe.
Yeah.
And did that really change the discussion in the country?
Look, it did. The Lint Cafe siege in Sydney did, as did. I mean, there's been other events. Just a short time before that, there was a young kid in Melbourne who was radicalised, and he tried to kill a couple of police officers, stabbed them repeatedly. He was shot dead. That was probably, our first taste of it. Lint affected the public. It wasn't just targeted at police. But we've been really fortunate in this country. We've had our counter-terrorism officers and authorities foil several plots. We've just had someone imprisoned for what was called the Anzac Day terror plot, a really significant day within our calendar. The plot there was to run over a police officer, behead them, take their gun, and shoot more people. Um, we've had a Mother's Day plot that's before the courts now, which was again, going to be targeting the public from the information that's out there. And so there's been and the biggest one we had was about a decade ago, if not longer. No, about a decade ago, which was quite advanced plans to bomb the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which is
Mm-hmm.
our biggest sporting stadium here. So we've been really fortunate that these plots have been stopped in their tracks. But those lone wolf attacks, as we call them, they're not so easily stopped. And there has been we had a police member shot in Sydney last year in an attack by a young kid. I think it was 15, 16, who was again radicalised. So we've had a taste of it, but nowhere like places like France and Belgium where their issues seem to be so advanced that you wonder how they're ever going to get on top of it.
Yeah, is that the irony too? Is that it's like the better that our security services are, the more things that they
Mm,
stop, and often we don't know that they stop them until sometimes months or years later. And then at the same time, it makes the threat seem lower. So then
mm.
people want to be more tolerant. And again, tolerance basically is good, but you don't
Mm.
have a full picture. And I guess that's really what the big issue is.
Absolutely, you can become complacent. And, we don't live in fear here. We don't think, we're going to be blown up around the street corner. But again, you've just got to be awake to the reality of what's happening around the world and that we are not immune from it. The terror deniers around here will bring up things like, oh, you've got much more chance of, dying in a car crash. Well,
Right.
of course you bloody do. We drive around everywhere, we've got millions of cars, but, do we not think about terror and we don't worry about that and make sure we doing things to counter it? Do we not worry about domestic violence because more people are dying on the roads from car accidents? I mean, it is just a stupid argument. There is just so much that is intellectually dishonest and just fraudulent in my mind when it comes to this space because people will do anything not to talk about it. People will do anything to deny that it's even an issue. And it obviously is an issue. And this poll that came out this week shows that it is an issue and people are thinking about it, even if our elite media and politicians aren't willing to discuss it.
Yeah. Can you think of anything else that we're so paralyzed to talk about? Because I really can't. In 2016, is there anything else that we treat with such kid gloves that is of such importance? And I get email from people literally all over the world, from almost every country,
Mm.
saying that their governments are doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, it seems to, not be every Western nation seems to be dealing with it. In Australia, I think the other issue that seems to be taboo, but is a significant issue, is what's happening in a lot of our Indigenous communities. Again, it's something that people don't talk about because if you do talk about it, you can get labelled a racist very quickly, even though you care enough to want to actually do something about it and to at least put it on the public to publicly discuss it. Even we've got kids who are being really mistreated, neglected, and they're not being saved by the authorities. They're not being taken into care at the same level as you would expect. Sorry, let me rephrase that. They actually are taken into care at greater rates than the non-Indigenous community, but at the point where the authorities take them seems to be a lot higher than but no white kid I don't think would be allowed to be mistreated in that way for so long before they are saved. And we've got this stolen generation um, narrative in our history that the authorities are scared now to actually save kids who are being abused, and because of that political correctness, because they don't want to create another stolen generation of Indigenous kids taken from their parents, that those kids are condemned to just terrible lives. They repeat the cycle. And I think that's just such a great shame. And there is a really significant gap in living standards, in life expectancy, in outcomes for our Indigenous community compared to the non-Indigenous community. And I believe a great deal of that has to do with these politically correct policies where we can't talk about what's happening. We can't talk about the rampant abuse, sexual abuse. We can't talk about the alcoholism, the drug use, because to even start discussing it is racist. The arguments will come up. Well, what about all the drug use and alcoholism in the non-Indigenous community? Well, yes, of course, but
Yeah.
that doesn't stop. Yes, it's exactly the same sort of um, phenomenon happening there, and it's just as destructive, and it actually hurts the people that they are trying to protect from discussion.
Right, and we see that exact same thing when it comes to the discussion on Islam, because if we don't talk about it, then who are you hurting the most? You're actually hurting Muslim people who are living under these theocracies
Mm,
and all that.
absolutely. The people who are, you know, killed the most and oppressed the most are other Muslims. And, Islamic State looks at Shiite Muslims, like my family, as infidels, no different from Jews or non believers, gays. They think they're deserving of nothing other than death as well. So, um, and extremist Islamists have been killing other Muslims, at a rate that is extraordinary for decades, and we just don't. It's almost not on our radar anymore because it happens so often.
But Rita, what about
There
the
is a
what about the abortion bombing in the Crusades?
well, that's it. Well, yeah. What about the Crusades? I mean, for God's sake, some of the arguments that are thrown up are just. They're just too stupid, but you've got to acknowledge them and you've got to counter them because they're being taught in universities. I've had these sort of arguments with university lecturers and journalists and academics who are on the public purse and are just spewing forth bullshit, and it's maddening.
Spewing forth bullshit. That could be the title of a book that we should probably co-write that book. So jumping back for a second, talking about Australia's role in the world, what is the Australian sort of ethos about what you feel your role should be? Obviously, you guys aren't that interventionist, but you've been part of coalitions and things like that. What is the
Mm.
the feeling there of what your purpose in the world should be?
We're pretty laid back about most things. We don't try to sort of set the agenda or, enforce our belief systems. But yeah, we have been a good corporate. We've been a good global citizen.
Oh man, that
We've
Freudian slip is going to be replayed many, many times.
um, but yeah, I think our history. We can be quite proud of our involvement in World War II, our involvement, with the Allied forces, and I think we do feel a little bit removed geographically. We are so far from so much of what's happening around the world. But these days, it's all there in your hand, in your phone. It's immediate. You know what's happening as soon as it happens. We're living in a time where those borders don't seem to mean as much. So I think we're fairly relaxed about our place in the world. We do have those amongst us, as you have in every community, who want to set the agenda. They want to be, we had a carbon tax for a while, and the rationale was there. We're going to lead the world in an emission trading scheme. We're going to be the standard bearers in fighting global warming, and that government got thrown out really quickly. So yeah, that didn't that didn't last too long. So I think overall, most Australians recognise they were pretty lucky. We've got a very good standard of living. We've got our own concerns, all sorts of issues from housing affordability to the threat of terror. But I think we're pretty happy with seeing what's happening around the world and feeling fortunate that it's not happening in our backyard yet.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's that water thing. Being big and surrounded by water, it's pretty good. Um, what do you make of our crazy election here? And not only what do you make of it, but what kind of coverage in Australia, just in mainstream media, is our election getting? Because it's all we have here. Any of the cable news, 24-hour days, that's all we talk about.
Oh, we're getting a lot more than previously. There is a lot of American election coverage in our mainstream news, particularly television. Great deal of it, and all of it, almost all of it, is pretty much what you'd expect. It's very much, Trump is this maniac who's a racist and sexist, and some of the reports I've seen, which are supposed to be just straight news reports, have been again extraordinary in being little, editorials that are absolutely biased.
Sure.
Personally, I don't know what. I mean, I've got a great deal of thoughts. I'm not a fan of either candidate. I can't be enthusiastic for Trump, but I completely understand the phenomenon. I understand people being utterly fed up and wanting an anti-establishment figure. And I know why he appeals to people. I think a lot of things that the media sees gaffes and sees huge errors in his character are actually enormous assets and are what appeal to a lot of people. So it's been just fascinating. I would love to be there for the last month or two and just see how it unfolds. But Trump's some of his greatest enemies are again his greatest assets. You look at what's happening now with the protests in Charlotte and the protests that were happening at his rallies, and you think the average American looking at that would actually sympathise with him, would understand some of the things he's been saying about what the country has turned into. Charlotte is just extraordinary. You've got a black cop shooting and seems to be an armed black man, and the place is being torn apart, and now black protesters shot another black protester. But
Right.
it's
In a city with a Democratic mayor.
Yeah, but it is Whitey's fault somehow. This black on black violence that's happened has somehow cause for just looting and beatings and just mass mindless violence that's been characterised as some sort of a protest that's got some purpose, and it doesn't. It is just mindless looting and violence, and it should be called what it is. And again, I think the public can see what it is, but the media narrative is trying to paint it as something other than that. And I think that is a great, I think that's something else we have in common in Australia and America, Europe, is the media being out of touch with its readers, viewers, listeners. They are just increasingly, there's a gap between members of the media and the mainstream population, and I think that's not healthy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you use the phrase out of touch, because I think one of the debates we're constantly having here, and the reason that online shows are working, is that is it out of touch, or is it that they're actually in it with the politicians? Do you think it's like a sort of generational thing and just a technology thing, and we're all walking around with phones, so now we're all on the ground journalists, or is it that they're actually in it with the people in power, so they have a vested interest in keeping that game going? Or maybe both.
Well, in the US, it may be a bit of that. In Australia, I don't think it is that. I don't think it's because they're part of the establishment or the elite. I think it's just the ideological disposition of a great number of the members of the media, and it's a great many of them are not. They look at the mainstream. Well, one, they don't acknowledge the mainstream is actually mainstream. They quite often think
Right.
because they're surrounded by like-minded people that their views are the prevalent views, and they're not. Or they just look at the mainstream with sort of condemnation, as if they're too stupid to believe what they believe. And I think it's again really unhealthy at a time where the mainstream media needs its audience more than ever to be poles apart from what the great majority of the population thinks. I think is really unfortunate. Yeah, and in Australia anyway, I think it's just a simple matter of the politics of the individuals within the media tends to be very much on the left, as it has been for generations, and the rest of the population is a lot more diverse than that. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and their views aren't being properly reflected. Of course, there are conservative commentators and writers and journalists, but very much in the minority and not reflecting the number of voters who are leaning that way.
Yeah. How much of this stuff do you think is actually just purely the fault of education, be it in Australia or be it here or wherever? I mean, I was watching the Charlotte, the riots, and there was this guy, they found a protester and he was screaming about Trump. And I'll preface this with saying this is not a defense of Trump, but Trump is not in power now. He's not the president or the governor of the state or the mayor of that city. And the guy was blaming Trump. And it's like, I'm not saying you should be blaming Hillary, and I'm not even saying you should be blaming Obama, but you're misdirecting things at somebody that has literally nothing to do, no power in place has anything to do with Trump right now. And to me, that's an education problem, not a political problem.
Very much. And yeah, those opinions come from ignorance, but they are supported again by quite often by mainstream media. Now, I remember, after even Orlando, there was talk about, Trump as if he had anything to do with it,
Right.
after the Orlando massacre. It is just absurd to be blaming him. But can you imagine how this news would be reported if it was a bunch of Trump supporters who were tearing apart a city, who were, you know, bashing bystanders for just the color of their skin, who were looting and just causing this widespread mayhem and destruction?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is completely idiotic, but it's become almost a joke. Whenever something horrible happens around the world, you blame Brexit, you blame Trump, you blame the Crusades. You can't ever actually
Those
pinpoint
freaking
the
crusades.
blame at the people responsible, because that would be, probably racist and gross.